What really happened to the mysterious civilization of Easter Island? For centuries, the rise and fall of this isolated culture has puzzled historians. Were they destroyed by war, famine, or perhaps something even stranger? Today, we'll uncover the truth behind one of the world's greatest archaeological mysteries. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, lying nearly 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile. Famous for its giant stone statues called Moai, this tiny speck in the Pacific Ocean holds secrets of a once thriving society that mysteriously collapsed. In this video, we'll explore the fascinating journey of the Easter Island civilization, from its rise to power to its dramatic fall, and unravel the mysteries that have baffled scientists and historians for centuries. The story of Easter Island's lost civilization begins with the arrival of the very first settlers, a journey that feels almost impossible even by today's standards. Imagine an ancient world without modern navigation, no GPS, no engines, no metal ships cutting through the water. And yet, centuries ago, a group of daring Polynesian voyagers set sail across the vast Pacific Ocean in nothing more than double-hulled wooden canoes, guided only by the stars, ocean swells, and wind patterns. They carried with them their families, animals, crops, and the determination to find new lands. This was not a short journey. Easter Island lies nearly 2,000 miles away from the nearest major landmass, making it one of the most isolated inhabited places on the planet. To reach it required an extraordinary understanding of the ocean, a skill that Polynesians had mastered over centuries of exploration. Historians and archaeologists believe these first settlers arrived on Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as it's traditionally known, around 800 to 1200 AD, but even that date remains debated, as new research sometimes pushes it earlier or later, adding to the mystery. What we do know is that when these explorers finally spotted the island after weeks, maybe months, at sea, what they found was a land unlike anything they had seen before. Easter Island wasn't the lush paradise that some other Polynesian islands were. It was relatively small, covering just 63 square miles with rolling hills, volcanic craters, and no large forests filled with towering coconut palms like on other islands in the Pacific. And yet, here they were, standing at the edge of the world, ready to build a life in complete isolation. Imagine what it must have felt like for those first settlers. They had no idea if anyone else lived there. They had no idea if the land could sustain them long-term. All they knew was that they had crossed a vast, unforgiving ocean and found a place to call home. For them, this was both the end of their voyage and the beginning of an entirely new civilization. The volcanic soil on the island, though not extremely fertile, could be coaxed into growing crops with careful farming. Sweet potatoes, or kamara, became a staple food, and the settlers brought chickens as another source of protein. Without large animals for hunting or other major food sources, these early Polynesians had to adapt quickly to survive in a land with limited natural resources. What's fascinating is that from the moment they set foot on Easter Island, the settlers were completely cut off from the outside world. No more voyages back and forth, no trade routes, no reinforcements from other islands. They were on their own, and the choices they made would determine the fate of their entire civilization. And yet, despite this isolation, they thrived for centuries. Over time, their population grew, their farming techniques became more sophisticated, and they developed a unique culture that was unlike any other in Polynesia. This was the very beginning of what would become the Rapa Nui civilization, a society that would eventually astonish the world with its massive stone statues and mysterious collapse. One of the first things the settlers likely did was divide the island into tribal territories. Archaeologists have found evidence that different clans or family groups controlled different parts of Easter Island, each with its own chiefs and sacred lands. These divisions would later play a huge role in the island's history, especially when it came to building the giant Moai statues that Easter Island is now famous for. But in these early centuries, life was about survival and learning how to use the island's limited resources wisely. The settlers had no metal tools, no beasts of burden, nothing but stone, wood, and their own ingenuity. And yet, they built stone houses, cultivated gardens, protected by rock walls to shield crops from the wind, and even created underground caves for storing food during times of drought. What truly stands out is the courage and ambition of these first Polynesians. They didn't just arrive, survive, and stop there. They laid the foundation for a complex society with its own religion, art, and political structure. From a few canoes of settlers emerged a civilization that would later carve and transport hundreds of massive stone statues weighing up to 80 tons each. And it all began with this moment, a handful of people landing on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific, with nothing but their wits and determination to guide them toward an unknown future as the centuries passed. The small group of settlers on Easter Island transformed into a thriving society, entering what many historians call the Golden Age of Rapa Nui civilization. This was the period when the islanders reached the height of their cultural, political, and artistic achievements. What began as a handful of families eking out a living on a remote volcanic island slowly evolved into a complex community with leaders, spiritual traditions, and remarkable innovations that still astonish archaeologists today. At the heart of this golden age were the monumental Moai statues, the enormous stone figures that have come to define Easter Island in the popular imagination. But before we dive into their construction, it's important to understand how the society itself grew so quickly. Did you know that before it was overrun by Europeans, Easter Island was home to a thriving civilization that built giant stone statues, developed their own writing system, and somehow managed to farm in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth? Welcome to the Golden Age of Easter Island, where the native Rapa Nui people had somehow mastered the art of growing crops on a tiny volcanic island in the Indian Ocean. At its peak, the island supported a population of 10,000 to 15,000 people. And these guys weren't just sitting around all day doing nothing. They were building massive stone enclosures called manavai to protect their crops from the harsh ocean winds. And they even invented a form of rock mulching to help retain moisture in the soil. It was like an episode of Seinfeld, but with more rocks. Now you might be thinking, great, they figured out how to farm, that's nice. But how did they have time to build those giant Moai statues? Well, it turns out that the Rapa Nui people were incredibly efficient. They had developed a system of raised beds for planting crops, which allowed them to farm more food than they could actually eat. This meant that some people could be dedicated to full-time jobs like building statues, and other full-time pursuits like staring at the ocean and wondering if there were other islands in the Indian Ocean. But how did they build those statues, you ask? Well, that's a story for another time, or maybe it's not. Maybe you should stick around because it turns out that the Rapa Nui people were incredibly organized. They had a system for transporting large objects across the island, and they used this knowledge to move statues that were sometimes over 30 feet tall and weighed 80 tons. They didn't have any metal tools, so they must have used some sort of advanced engineering method, like ramps and rollers. Or maybe it was pure mana or sacred energy that enabled them to move these massive statues. The Rapa Nui people also developed their own writing script called Rongorongo, which is considered one of the most important pieces of cultural achievement on the island. Unfortunately, almost all of the Rongorongo tablets have been destroyed, leaving us with very little understanding of this advanced civilization. In fact, we don't even know for sure how the Rapa Nui people got to Easter Island. One theory is that they arrived in canoes from what is now known as Polynesia, while others believe that they came from South America. Regardless of how they got there, they managed to create a complex society with its own culture, language, and traditions, all while building giant statues and writing their own script. Sadly, this golden age came to an end when European explorers arrived on the island in the 18th century. They brought with them diseases that devastated the native population and a desire for land that led to the enslavement of the Rapa Nui people. So, next time you're feeling down about your life, just remember that there are people on Easter Island who were building giant statues while simultaneously figuring out how to farm in the middle of the ocean. And that's pretty freaking cool. On the remote island of Pascua, also known as Easter Island, there existed an ancient civilization that flourished around the year 1400. Its inhabitants built enormous, human-like statues out of solid rock. These relics are all that remain of a people who may have once numbered in the tens of thousands. But what happened to them? How did their society collapse? In this video, we explore the rise and fall of Easter Island's Moai civilization. We begin our story in the year 1200 when sophisticated Rapa Nui society had developed on the island. Scholars believe they had an undeciphered script. Their language is believed to have been similar to that of the ancient Chileans. They crafted sharp tools out of basalt and greenstone. And unlike their neighbors in the Polynesian Triangle, they had no tradition of building boats. Instead, the Rapa Nui were masters of working with stone. All across the island, they created ceremonial platforms called ahu, often at the edge of cliffs overlooking the ocean. On top of these platforms, they erected massive stone statues which embodied the ancestral spirits or mana of their tribal leaders. They called these figures Moai. The word Moai simply means ancestor, so every Moai represented a clan's connection to its past. Today, over 800 Moai stand guard along the coast of Easter Island, silently staring out into the ocean. The largest is named Tukuturi and stands a staggering 9 meters tall. To make such large statues, the Rapa Nui traveled to the island's only quarry at Ranoruaku. There they selected suitable rocks for the statues and spent weeks chipping away at them until they looked like the chiefs they represented. Then the islanders used a technique known as pahaku, levando or rock levering to transport these giant statues to the ahu platforms. This was a system of rolling and walking the statues along a dirt road by leaning them against wooden supports. By changing the angle of these supports, the workers could make the Moai move forward. They likely did this during the night to avoid the intense heat of the midday sun. It took about 4,000 to 5,000 people and 2 weeks to move each statue. When they reached the platform, the workers would then raise the Moai upright and place it on top of the ahu. The final step was to install coral eyes for the statue. During the ceremony, the islanders believed that the mana or spiritual essence of the ancestors entered the statue through these eyes. In fact, the name given to the Moai by the Rapa Nui means the eyes of the gods. Now, while the Moai were primarily built to honor the dead, they also served as a reminder of the living. That's because atop each ahu sat a chief, the supposed intermediary between the gods and the people. Each year during the Tapati festival, the islanders would carry the Moai down the hill from the ahu. They would wrap the base of the statue with vines and flowers and then pull it towards the shore. As they walked, they sang and danced before the image, and the beat of the drums grew louder and louder. Finally, when the Moai reached the water, the islanders stopped and the drums fell silent. Then one brave man would swim out and touch the statue's nose. When he did so, the Moai were said to come alive and dive into the sea. There, they would search for fish and return with an abundance of seafood for the people. After the feast, the islanders would lead the Moai back up the hill, place it back on the platform, and prepare for another year. The creation and procession of the Moai were deeply spiritual events, but they also required a tremendous amount of manpower and resources. The Rapa Nui were able to afford these expenditures early on because Easter Island was covered in trees. Large trees were needed to build the canoes that brought settlers to the island and to provide timber for the houses and tools of the people. But as the population grew, so did the demand for wood. The Rapa Nui cleared more and more forest for new farmland and construction projects. But they really went too far when they started carving Moai. Each statue weighed approximately 12.5 tons and stood about 4 meters tall. That's about the size of a sperm whale. The islanders had to fell many trees to get enough wood to build the platforms and supports necessary to carve one Moai. By the year 1400, nearly half of Easter Island's trees had been chopped down. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, the loose dirt and gravel began to wash away. Rivers of mud ran down the hillsides during heavy rains, carrying fertile soil into the sea. Crops failed, and the people lost their ability to sustain themselves on the island. As if that weren't enough, the deforestation also had a negative impact on their fishing. The trees stabilized the shoreline, creating protected coves where fish could grow undisturbed. But without the trees, the waves crashed onto the shore, destroying the habitat and scaring away the fish. The people became desperate for food. Many starved to death while others resorted to eating the nests of sea turtle eggs. Those who survived turned to warfare. Rapa Nui society was structured around clans, each with their own Moai platform and territory. But as resources became scarcer, the clans competed for control of the island. Eventually, this competition turned violent. Between the years 1650 and 1720, the islanders waged war across the island. They pulled down rival Moai and hurled them to the ground, a practice known as the Huri Moai. They engaged in ritualistic battles, sometimes killing every single person on an Ahu platform, including the chief whose Moai the figures represented. It seemed as though everyone was fighting everyone else. Nobody knows exactly how long this civil war lasted or why it eventually ended, but the numbers tell a grim tale. Today, only about 6,000 people live on Easter Island. Their culture and language endured, but their way of life changed forever after first contact with Europeans. The survivors were forced to work as slaves on cinnamon plantations, and many converted to Christianity. Today, the descendants of the Rapa Nui are known as the Rapa Nui or the Easter Islanders. They live much like modern people, wearing clothes, farming crops, and fishing for sustenance. They have even rebuilt some of their sacred Moai and continue to honor their ancestors. So what caused the collapse of this society? While historians debate this question, we can thank one man for shedding light on the island's mysteries. His name was Thor Heyerdahl. He was a Norwegian adventurer who studied the history of the Rapa Nui. He believed the islanders deliberately destroyed their Moai during the Huri Moai period. He argued that the statues weren't toppled by earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, but by the hands of the islanders. Heyerdahl's most famous discovery was the presence of red petroglyphs painted on some of the Moai. Some scholars now claim these red markings resemble the script of ancient Chile. If Heyerdahl's theory is correct, this would prove that the Rapa Nui had a written language long before the Spanish arrived. Sadly, Thor Heyerdahl passed away in 2002. He never got to see his work gain widespread acceptance. However, recent research does appear to be moving in this direction. Heyerdahl wrote several books about his explorations, including The Kingdom of the Incas, Aku Aku, and The Time of the Puma. He also helped popularize the Kon-Tiki expedition, an exploration of the Pacific Ocean by raft. Heyerdahl was fascinated by ancient civilizations throughout the Americas and Polynesia. He spent decades trying to prove that people from South America visited the islands of Oceania before Christopher Columbus. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out my other content. I hope you learned something new. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Same ingenuity and determination that had carved the Moai could not stop the ecological collapse that centuries of deforestation and overuse had set in motion. Yet even as the island's resources dwindled and its social order fractured, the people of Rapa Nui endured. They adapted as best they could, turning to new ways of living, new sources of food, and new beliefs to make sense of the changes overtaking their world. But just as they were struggling to survive the consequences of their own actions, another force was about to arrive on their shores, one that would bring an entirely new wave of challenges the islanders could never have imagined. Just as the people of Rapa Nui were struggling with dwindling resources, internal conflicts, and the collapse of the old ways, a new and completely unforeseen chapter in their history began. On a distant horizon one day in the early 18th century, the islanders would have seen something no generation before them had ever witnessed: towering ships with massive sails approaching their shores. It was the arrival of Europeans, and with them came a world that would forever change Easter Island in ways the Rapa Nui could not have imagined. The first recorded European contact came on Easter Sunday in 1722, when the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen landed on the island, giving it the name we know today, Easter Island. For the Rapa Nui, this encounter must have been a bewildering and possibly terrifying experience. They had lived in complete isolation for centuries, their entire universe defined by the limits of their small island. Now, strangers from across the sea arrived in massive vessels, wearing strange clothes, speaking unknown languages, and wielding weapons the islanders had never seen before. At first, these encounters were marked by curiosity but also tension. Accounts from Roggeveen's landing suggest that misunderstandings quickly turned violent, with several islanders killed in clashes with the Dutch. For a people already facing hunger, internal strife, and the loss of their traditions, this first meeting with outsiders was hardly a peaceful introduction to the wider world. And this was only the beginning. Over the next century, more ships came, Spanish, British, and later whalers and traders from around the globe. With each arrival, the traditional life of the Rapa Nui people was further disrupted. European sailors brought not only goods and technology but also diseases that spread rapidly among populations with no prior exposure or immunity. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and other illnesses would devastate the island in the years to come, reducing the population even further after centuries of ecological and social decline had already weakened it. But disease was only part of the tragedy that followed. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave traders raided Easter Island, capturing as much as half of the remaining population, including chiefs, priests, and skilled workers, to be sold into forced labor in South America. Among those taken were many who held the knowledge of the island's oral traditions, religious practices, and even the ability to read and write the mysterious Rongorongo script. When a few surviving slaves were eventually returned to the island, they brought with them smallpox, leading to an epidemic that killed many more. Whole family lineages were wiped out, and with them, much of the island's cultural memory vanished forever. As if this weren't enough, missionaries arrived soon after, converting the remaining population to Christianity and dismantling the old religious practices tied to the Moai and the ancestral cults. The traditional beliefs that had united the people for centuries, the ceremonies performed at the Ahu platforms, the carving of new Moai, all of it came to an abrupt end. The once proud statues, already toppled during earlier clan conflicts, were left to erode in silence, their spiritual significance fading as the islanders struggled simply to survive. By the late 19th century, Easter Island had been annexed by Chile, and its remaining inhabitants were confined to small settlements while much of their land was leased to foreign sheep ranching companies. The Rapa Nui, once the masters of their own isolated world, had become a marginalized people on their own island, their population reduced to barely 100 individuals at its lowest point. The towering Moai, the remnants of their ancestors' power and ambition, stood as silent witnesses to a civilization that had been brought to the brink not only by its own choices but also by forces from beyond the horizon that it could never have prepared for. And yet, even in the face of disease, slavery, cultural loss, and colonization, the spirit of the Rapa Nui people did not disappear entirely. They adapted, held on to fragments of their traditions, and continued to live in the shadow of the Moai that still watched over the land. Reminders of both the greatness and the suffering of their ancestors centuries after the rise and fall of the Rapa Nui civilization, the island's story has continued to unfold through the eyes of archaeologists. Historians and scientists determined to uncover the truth behind its mysteries. For generations, outsiders looked at the toppled Moai statues and the barren landscape and assumed the people of Easter Island had destroyed themselves in a frenzy of statue building, cutting down every last tree until nothing remained. This idea of ecocide, a society bringing about its own destruction, became the dominant theory for decades. But as research deepened in the 20th and 21st centuries, a more complex and fascinating picture began to emerge, one that revealed both the resilience of the Rapa Nui people and the powerful lessons their story holds for the modern world. Excavations across the island began uncovering evidence that challenged earlier assumptions. For example, studies of ancient soils and pollen showed that while deforestation did occur, it wasn't necessarily the reckless act of a people blindly destroying their environment. Instead, rats brought by the early settlers may have played a significant role in preventing the regrowth of palm trees by eating their seeds, accelerating deforestation in ways the islanders couldn't control. This suggested that the ecological decline of Easter Island was not simply the result of human mismanagement, but a combination of factors, some beyond the people's knowledge or power to stop. Other research revealed that even after the forests disappeared, the Rapa Nui people adapted in remarkable ways to keep growing food in harsh conditions. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of rock gardens where stones were carefully arranged to protect crops from wind, conserve moisture, and add nutrients to the soil as the rocks slowly broke down over time. These gardens showed that the people didn't just give up when resources became scarce, They innovated, finding ways to survive despite the challenges. Far from being passive victims of collapse, the Rapa Nui demonstrated resilience and creativity in the face of environmental change. The Moai themselves have also revealed new secrets. For a long time, people believed the statues were only heads and torsos because that was all that was visible above ground. But excavations at the Rano quarry, where most of the Moai were carved, uncovered that many of the statues actually have full bodies buried beneath the earth, covered over centuries by erosion and sediment. Petroglyphs, intricate carvings, have been found on some of these buried parts, suggesting the Moai carried not only spiritual power but also complex cultural symbolism we are only beginning to understand. The mysterious Rongorongo script carved on wooden tablets remains undeciphered to this day. Some scholars believe it may hold records of the island's history, genealogy, or religious rituals. If one day its meaning is unlocked, it could transform our understanding of the Rapa Nui civilization in ways we can hardly imagine right now. Each discovery on Easter Island seems to open as many questions as it answers, keeping the island's allure alive for historians and travelers alike. Modern researchers have also challenged the old narrative of a violent, catastrophic collapse before European contact. Some evidence suggests that the population decline may have been more gradual, with communities continuing to live on the island in smaller numbers even after the era of statue building ended. It was the arrival of Europeans, bringing diseases, slavery, and cultural upheaval, that delivered the most devastating blow, rather than an isolated act of self-destruction by the Rapa Nui people themselves. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of Easter Island lies not only in solving the mystery of what happened there, but also in the lessons it offers the modern world. This tiny, remote island was like a miniature planet with limited resources and nowhere else to go when things went wrong. The challenges the Rapa Nui faced, deforestation, soil loss, overpopulation, and cultural upheaval, echo the challenges humanity faces today on a global scale. Their story is a warning about what can happen when the balance between people and nature is lost. But it is also a story of adaptability, resilience, and survival against incredible odds. Standing among the Moai today, visitors see more than just silent stone figures. They see the legacy of a people who crossed vast oceans to build a complex society in complete isolation, who faced hunger, war, and foreign conquest, yet whose descendants still live on the island, preserving what they can of their culture and history. The fall of the Rapa Nui civilization was not the simple tale of self-destruction it was once believed to be. It was a story shaped by ambition, spirituality, environmental change, and the arrival of forces from far beyond their world, leaving behind mysteries that continue to captivate us centuries later. And so, the story of Easter Island, Rapa Nui, comes full circle. From the daring voyage of the first Polynesian settlers who crossed the endless Pacific to build a thriving civilization, to the rise of a culture that carved hundreds of colossal Moai statues in honor of their ancestors, to the challenges of dwindling resources, internal conflicts, and the devastating impact of European contact, the history of this remote island is as complex as it is fascinating. For centuries, outsiders looked at the toppled statues and barren landscape and saw only mystery, imagining a society that destroyed itself in a frenzy of ambition. But modern discoveries have revealed a far richer story, one of ingenuity, resilience, and survival against overwhelming odds. The people of Rapa Nui were not simply victims of their own excess. They adapted, innovated, and endured even as their world changed forever. Today, the Moai still stand as silent witnesses to everything the island has endured, symbols of human creativity, spirituality, and determination. They remind us that civilizations, no matter how isolated or powerful, are never separate from the environment that sustains them. Easter Island's story carries a warning for all of us. Like the Rapa Nui, we too live on an island, a planet with finite resources and a fragile balance between humanity and nature. Their rise and fall echo across time, urging us to learn from their triumphs and their mistakes before history repeats itself on a much larger scale. Because in the end, the mystery of Easter Island is not just about the past. It is about us, our future, and the choices we make with the world we have been given.